Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our retake of the 35th Chebacco Chat. Let me get our presentation up and we'll show you the screen we want you to see. Very good. Here we go. Sorry, earlier version of this presentation, we didn't have any sound. I don't know why, but we're going to try it again. Here we go. I want to say thanks to Bar Harbor Trust for sponsoring today's Chebacco Chat. This is the 35th episode in this series that began in April 2020, just as we all began to shelter in place. It's also the last episode of the year. We'll take a break over the holidays. And it also happens to be my last as the historian for the Mount Desert Islands Historical Society. I will retire at the end of the year. I so admire this organization, its board and staff and volunteers. I appreciate the support of all our members over the 10 years that I've been here, and we will always appreciate your interest in our work. Feel free to post or email comments on the recording of this, wherever you see it, on Facebook Live or Zoom, and I'll personally answer those questions for you. The starting point of this talk is an exhibit we created for the summer where so many people couldn't go to exhibits. It was a summer exhibit for the Soamesville Museum, and I'd like to take you on a curated guided tour of the exhibit Centennials, Then and Now. To mark Maine's bicentennial year, we wanted to understand why the celebration of the 1920 centennial was so very different from the way we think about the 2020 bicentennial. In comparing the two celebrations, we asked, what happened to history? In this exhibit, we wanted to explore why the story told in 1920 sounds so different from the one we tell in 2020. And we approach this with an underlying idea of historiography. That's a term that doesn't get talked about much outside of academic circles, but historiography is a history of history, a recognition that each generation tells history in different ways, adding information that previous generations were unaware of, couldn't see, or chose to ignore. The commemorations of Maine statehood in 1920 and 2020 show how our representations of the past change as we incorporate new voices and perspectives and uncover new sources of information. In 1920, when Maine was only 100 years old, Mainers celebrated statehood with an unreserved pride in a century of progress. The history they told was, as they described it, full of stirring romance, matchless heroism, and marvelous achievements. State leaders marked the event with great fanfare. They organized parades and spectacles and taught school children about a proud heritage. The 1920 centennial pointed with pride to, quote, the struggle to subdue the wild, to uproot the forest and plant the farm, to harness the rivers and make them giants of industry, the story of war and the courage displayed by the men of Maine and the women also, from the skirmish with the Indian to participation in the World War. In 2020, while we celebrate our love of place and people, we also tell a more complicated version of Maine's history than the one celebrated in 1920. We acknowledge, for instance, the ecological damage caused by Maine's industrial development, the mistreatment of Maine's native people, and the discrimination directed at waves of immigrants who have come to make new homes in Maine. For the 2020 bicentennial, Penobscot Tribal Ambassador Molly and Dana expressed a more nuanced view of statehood when she told an audience of scholars, I cannot stand before you this evening and be a cheerleader for the bicentennial after my people endured generations of attempted genocide, broken treaties, racism, disease, addiction, and all the spokes in the wheel of colonial oppression. However, I can stand here in front of your listening ears and open hearts with the knowledge that we have come so far and have the power to keep going. Maine's a changeable place. Its shoreline moves with the tides twice per day, and its boundaries have changed in accord with power and politics over centuries. In the 15th century, when Europeans began ranging farther west in search of more abundant fishing grounds, they encountered Wabanaki people who had been here for 10,000 years. The Wabanaki thrived in this diverse and generous landscape, moving seasonally throughout their homeland to access the resources they needed. Take a look at this map of our region. With the political boundaries removed and the waterways enhanced, it shows how it shows routes for human travel and networks throughout the region that were not blocked off by sharp lines that the coming colonists would draw. Wabanaki and European nations had different concepts of land ownership. To the Wabanaki, land was not a commodity that you owned, it was something with which you had a relationship. The Wabanaki concept of land ownership is how we might think of the air or sea, elements that are not owned by anyone, but belong to everyone. Ignoring Wabanaki's sovereignty, both France and England laid claim to this land and fought over it for nearly 150 years. In 1622, King James I of England granted much of the region to Sir Fernando Gorges, although Gorges never set foot there. This parcel would become known as the province of Maine, incorporating the land of 5 sovereign nations already living there: the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Micmac, Maliseet, and Abenaki, collectively known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. The movement for independent statehood for Maine began almost at the same time Massachusetts was founded in 1780, and it continued for 40 years. Historian Liam Reardon described the process as an extended Brexit debate. And Professor Reardon covered this topic thoroughly in Chebacco Chat number 2, so I won't cover the same ground again, but suffice to say that Mainers eventually came around to favor the idea, but not citizens of Mount Desert. In the town of Mount Desert, the final vote on Maine statehood took place on July 25th, 1819, at the home of Davis Wascott Esquire, a landmark building that still stands on Beach Hill Road. The town's voters rejected statehood by a margin of 13-0. When the proposal for Maine statehood was brought to Congress, it became connected to the issue of slavery that was then roiling the nation. The Missouri Compromise was advanced by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who proposed that Maine enter the Union as a free state and Missouri enter the Union as a slave state, thus maintaining the balance in Congress of free states and slave states. Maine statehood was transformed from a matter of local preference to one of national import. A century later, Maine marked its 1920 centennial with great fanfare and expense, putting years of planning into preparations for the once-in-a-lifetime event. Organizers promised a celebration that would mark Maine's first century, they called it, on a gigantic scale. 100 years later, we are in awe of their efforts, however we might disagree with their interpretation of history. Organizers put on a centennial celebration in Portland from June 28th to July 5th, 1920, that featured visits to the city by warships, aircraft, and cavalry troops. There was a presentation in Deering Park by Maine's Wabanaki nations. And each day of the festival focused on a theme: history, music, exposition, women, Mardi Gras, veteran firemen, churches, and independence. It was quite a scene. And throughout the year, Centennial organizers recognized that 1920 would represent a learning opportunity for Maine school students. Students, they said, should become familiar with the history of Maine, from the struggle to subdue the wilderness and plant a civilization to these days of comfort, education, and culture. The organizers wanted to impress on students how far we had come. They also wanted to extol the virtues of the Maine citizenry, and they outlined it in about 20 points, of which a few are excerpted here. They describe Maine's advantages as having a sturdy people who retain the courage and conscience of their Puritan ancestors, a high-minded people who believe in the church and practice Christianity, and a history filled with bravery, fortitude, and integrity, which begets sturdy sons and fair daughters equal to the task America demands in order to develop free institutions and the right sort of democracy. Hardly a description that you would see almost anywhere today. In Bar Harbor, Philip Emery's award-winning high school essay stated, "Mount Desert has become the home of many true and patriotic people. Its beauty has been here always, but its prosperity has come with the white man." A statement that, of course, would make us cringe. History and the way we tell it has changed. In 1980, Howard Zinn's text, A People's History of the United States, sparked both praise and high criticism when it advanced a counter-narrative to traditional versions of American history. The text is often included today in high school history courses. What a 1920 history class would call the discovery of the New World, a 2020 class might describe as the European conquest of North America. In a history classroom at Mount Desert Island High School, students are challenged to critique primary sources, to think critically about how history is made, and to evaluate the validity of arguments deployed in the service of present-day political divisions. Students arrive at a more complicated and nuanced historical picture than their counterparts of a century ago. In 1920, a book published by the Centennial Commission featured the great personages of Maine history. All were male governors: Carl Milliken, the governor of 1920, William King, Maine's first governor, and the governors of Maine in times of war. In Mr. Puglisi's classroom at MDI High School, students choose the historical characters they most admire and put their pictures on the wall. Here you'll find Maine's first woman governor, Janet Mills, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, and journalist and NAACP founder Ida B. Wells. Today, we tend to think in more complex ways about histories that we once thought were straightforward narratives. We add the perspectives of people who were ignored in traditional histories: the disenfranchised, women, immigrants, people of color, LGBTQ people, and Native Americans. We challenge the authority of men who have dominated society and possess the means to tell their side of the story in books, monuments, and centennial celebrations. An early history of Mount Desert Island begins, and we find this in our Historical Society's archives. It's titled Chapter 1, The Beginning, 1755 to 1762. The story is written as if the island's history started with the arrival of European colonists. A founding myth of Mount Desert Island history, popular at the time of the 1920 Centennial, begins with a first, the arrival of Abraham Somes at the head of Somes Sound in 1761, and there is a last, a native Sockham, who supposedly gave Abraham a deed to the local land written on birch bark. In this telling, the first settler establishes the village of Somesville, and the last Indian is never heard from again. Hundreds of local stories of firsting and lasting are preserved in archives throughout New England. Local historical societies like ours had a central role in perpetuating the myth of the vanishing Indian. This historical interpretation has persisted despite evidence to the contrary. Of her 19th century childhood, Adelma Somes Joy, who lived from 1837 to 1930, wrote, "It may be that Indians were here when Abraham Somes came up the Sound and settled at what is now called Somesville. The Indians of the Penobscot tribe, since I can remember, were always camping around the freshwater ponds. This Salem Town Junior Esquire map of 1807 shows how this land was partitioned and distributed to colonists and made mostly inaccessible to Wabanaki people. In 2020, we recognize that Abraham Soames was not the first long-term inhabitant of Mount Desert Island, and the Wabanaki he encountered were by no means the last Indians. European colonists did not occupy an empty landscape, but instead displaced Wabanaki people who had considered this place their homeland for thousands of years. These portraits present citizens of the Wabanaki nations, Micmac, Maliseet, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy people who are actively involved in the preservation of their tribal history, which is the history of Maine. For this portrait series, each historian chose an artifact or location to represent the main focus of their work. Many of them combine research with activism. For the Wabanaki people, preservation of their history is an act of political self-representation and resistance. In 1920, the leaders of what was then called Lafayette National Park saw the Centennial as an opportunity to promote the new public lands. When visitors arrived at Lafayette National Park, they would be treated not only to the wild beauty of the place, but also a history lesson. Between 1918 and 1920, Park Superintendent George B. Dorr renamed the island's mountains, giving them titles like Cadillac, Champlain, Saint-Sauveur, and Norumbega, as if they were chapters in a history book. The park's noble granite masses would be what he described as true historic documents that will record forever to succeeding generations the human background of the park. Acadia's mountain names have enshrined a version of history that was current in 1920. History, once portrayed as a record of significant events and dates, has become the study of stories of the lives of ordinary people. You can see examples of this approach in the Mount Desert Island Historical Society's History Harvest project. In a history harvest, we ask contributors to lend us an artifact from their family story, like this photograph of Ginny Wheeler flying a kite in Soamesville on her 9th birthday. Ginny grew up to be an archaeologist working in Rome. We scan or photograph the artifact and collect a brief oral history from the donor. The images and accompanying description are presented in a digital exhibit on our website under the History Harvest. From the Becker family of Pennsylvania, we learned of their ancestor, Richard Herman Roth, who was born in Prussia in 1880 and emigrated to America in 1893. He became a horticulturalist and photographer with a prosperous business near Philadelphia. His family visited Northeast Harbor from 1906 to 1912, and Roth photographed the things he loved: his family, gardens, and the waterways, islands, and beautiful surroundings of the region. Alain de Choubel shared this photograph of a replica trebuchet he made in the early 2000s. A trebuchet is a medieval siege engine designed to cast stones at fortress walls. Alain used his to throw pumpkins far out into Frenchman Bay, though he says cabbages withstood the G-forces better and left a trail of confetti to mark their flight path. So, what happened to the way we tell history? At the time of the 1920 Centennial, the Maine school superintendent provided teachers with extensive outlines for the study of state history, lessons in citizenship, and Americanization. In the previous 20 years, nearly 15 million immigrants had come to America. State and national authorities thought of these newcomers as a foreign invasion. They believed that history should encourage immigrants to adapt to the American way of life and serve the cause of American patriotism. One state decreed that no textbook that was derogatory or disparaged the achievement of American heroes was allowed to be used, nor one that questioned the sincerity of the aims and purposes of the founders of the Republic. In the intervening century, many changes have swept through history as it is taught in the classroom, in books, and in movies. The traditional narrative of the Centennial took a battering in the years that followed the First World War, during the Great Depression, and throughout the cultural unraveling of the 1960s, when almost every supposition about American life was turned over. The traditional narrative also experienced periods of rebound, serving a patriotic purpose in the flush of victory following the Second World War and during the Cold War. Since 2001, Maine law requires that Maine Native American history and culture be taught in Maine schools. Once skewed toward the interest of privilege, history has increasingly given voice to people of color, women, and the disenfranchised. History today finds itself astride nearly every political and cultural divide that projects present-day polarization back onto the ways we interpret the past. From the centennial to the bicentennial, the way we tell our own history has changed so profoundly that we wonder, what will history look like in the future? I will editorialize and suggest that history may look at our blind spots, just as in 1920, no one seemed to have a vision. No one promoting the centennial seemed to have an understanding of the terrible effect of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan that was then just rising in Maine. Perhaps 100 years from now, historians will wonder why we seem so blind to the effects of climate change. And maybe there's issues that are out there that we don't even realize today. Well, I would like to say thanks to the exhibits team that put this exhibit together. I'm going to go through these slides and show you who those people are. They did a tremendous job of helping us gather all the materials and knowledge we need to create this exhibit. We also had the help of donors like Machias Savings Bank and the members of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society to fund its costs. And we had the generous lending of materials and images from organizations like Abbey Museum, Maine Historical Society, and the Osher Map Library. Lots of advisors and friends, and formal advice from the administrative staff and tribal historic preservation offices of the Aroostook Band of Micmacs, the Holton Bands of Maliseet Indians, the Passamaquoddy tribe at Indian Township, and the Penobscot Nation. Once again, thanks so much for watching this re-recording of Chebacco Chats. I'm glad you were able to see it. If you have questions, please post them on as comments under the Facebook post, and return the email that you received for the Zoom link with your questions, and we'll make sure to answer them personally if you'd like, or in a more public setting. Once again, thanks very much for participating. We're going to take the holidays off and come back to you on January 7th when Patrick Calloway will host Chebacco Chats. He's the collections manager and a historian. He will have a topic for you to discuss on January 7th, 2021. Until then, thanks for being here, everyone. Take care.